So, Miracle Musical's album Hawaii Part 2 is pretty interesting. There's definitely something going on with the lyrics, but when you just listen to it, it doesn't make that much sense. It's pretty abstract, pretty vague, but there's definitely some kind of complicated story hidden underneath. Me and Albert have made it our goal to decipher this story, figure out what exactly is going on, and how each song connects.
Okay, so in Hawaii Part 2, there's probably two distinct main characters. The main protagonist, probably named Simon, and his girlfriend, who we're going to call Stella.
So just to clear some stuff up, this is just our interpretation. There is no correct interpretation of this album. This is just our attempt at weaving some kind of coherent story together. Alright, so let's start at the very, very beginning with the first track.
The first track on this album is called Introduction to the Snow, which is already an interesting choice because snow is not usually not what you'd expect, and it takes a second, at least it took me a second, the first time I read the title, to realize that it was an N and not an H. It's not Introduction to the Show, it's Introduction to the Snow, which is referenced later. The song begins with the line, "Alone at the edge of the universe, humming a tune," and our interpretation of Edge of the Universe is describing the line between life and death. Simon is about to die, or is dying, with sparkling crystal souls aglow. These souls could be the other souls moving with him to the afterlife, past the edge of the universe. And it also offers snowy imagery with the idea of snowflake crystals. Another reference to the title of the song being Introduction to the Snow and not Show. And ironically, the last line of the song is "You'll live forever tonight," which is absolutely not true, because it's pretty much confirmed that Simon is not going to live forever. He's dying.
Our interpretation overall is that the entire album is sort of Simon's life flashing before his eyes, which is why it would start with him dying. So the actual sort of story of his life that he's remembering really kicks in with the second track, which is Isle Unto Thyself. Isle Unto Thyself is when Simon and Stella actually meet and fall in love. So the verses are sung by a male voice, so we assume it's Simon speaking. He makes a lot of references to Greek mythology in these lyrics, with lines like, "I was a victim of magic Apollo, catching my breath as I bled on the ground." It references how Apollo, one of the 12 Greek Olympians, had a very bad track record with romances. They always ended in some kind of tragedy. And it could also reference the Iliad, when Apollo actually breathed power into Hector when he was badly injured during the Trojan War. There's another line, "Sudden invincible flowing a river," which is another Iliad reference, when, Achilles is dipped into the river Styx, becoming invincible. This again connects to the idea of a tragic love story, with Achilles and his lover dying at the end of the Iliad. These lyrics are pushing a sort of grim foreshadowing for later, which, of course, we will get into later in the story. Despite how sad the verses are in lyrics, the melody is actually very upbeat, which sort of enforces the idea that it's mostly, at this point, just a very sweet sort of love story. The chorus is sung by a female voice, so we assume it's Stella. It references a blinding shining star in one line, which we interpret as being representative of both sort of happiness, love, but also possibly being a reference to the light that you supposedly see when you die. This sort of blinding light is brought up several other times throughout the album, which enforces our theory that the entire album is sort of Simon on his deathbed reminiscing in some way. On to the next song.
The next song is Black Rainbows, which is probably from Stella's point of view. Most of the song is backed by Hawaiian chanting. They're singing red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. They're singing just the colors of the rainbow in the background, which makes this album technically in 4 languages, which is pretty neato. The lyrics are pretty simple and just describing like rainbows and sunlight, and it characterizes Stella as happy and upbeat, and it's honestly a pretty simple song. There's probably more to it. There's always more to this album.
So after Black Rainbows, we get the song White Ball. So I want to start off with the title. I think the title itself is kind of interesting. It seems to be referencing the album cover of Hawaii Part 2, which has a bright white moon, but this moon is also, in the background you can see an anglerfish. So the moon isn't just the light of the moon, it's also, the light of the anglerfish, which, in case you didn't know, the anglerfish has that little light to attract its prey, and then it kills its prey. So the title already has this sort of connotation of things being great and beautiful, but also there being some kind of underlying danger. The song itself is just a very lovely sounding romantic duet between Simon and Stella, the male voice and the female voice. The lyrics reference a lot of stuff about fate and destiny. One of the lines is, "Fate decides how these columns align." So there's a lot of just things about sort of true love and all that kind of whatever. There's one line I want to point out, which is, "The awakening light will bathe." This is another one of those little references I mentioned earlier about the constant bringing up of some kind of light. Most of the song is actually pretty just romantic. "Each day I am new, I am yours" is a line. "Taking passionate steps" is a line. It's just it seems like at this point in the story, it's just illustrating the relationship between Simon and Stella. The final line, "Such impossible bliss," is repeated 6 times before the song ends. A lot of emphasis is put on this line. I think the wording is worth noting. It almost seems like the line is being repeated for the sake of irony, since the bliss being described, the romance, is impossible. As we'll see later in the album, this amazing love will not last very long, and it will actually end in tragedy. So that tragedy will actually be coming up in our very next song, which is Murders. In case you can't tell from the title of Murders, things are really starting to go wrong now in this story. The narrator of this song isn't actually Simon or Stella, which is pretty interesting. It's a third party. This narrator is sort of describing, from a different perspective, Simon and Stella going into the forest together. The first line is, "He was in the forest looking to see the trees, but none were there." He is obviously meant to be Simon. And looking to see the trees, but none were there is pretty interesting. I would interpret it as he didn't see the trees because he only had eyes for Stella, for his love. But the wording is definitely a little odd, so definitely a line that's up to interpretation. There's a line early in the song that references the Earl King. The line is, "She found the Earl King," she being Stella. The Earl King is the king of the fairies in old European mythology. And if you know anything about old European mythology, you know that fairies are actually pretty evil and terrible. So the Earl King stalks and kills children in the forest. So, more dark foreshadowing going on. After a while, the narrator actually inserts themselves into the story, saying, "I was in the middle ground, looking to find the flowers in the garden." They almost interrupt themselves in the song when they say, "looking to find the flowers in the garden," almost as if they were trying to say they were looking to find something else, but they interrupted themselves by saying flowers in the garden, which is a little odd. When describing the flowers, the narrator says, "Wearing of the hate me not, wait they forgot." This line references 2 things. It references the whole "he loves me" or she loves me not," where you pluck petals off of a flower. Then it also references an actual type of flower, the forget-me-not. In floral language, forget-me-nots actually represent eternal and undying true love. So it's interesting that the narrator is bringing that up. Another line, "Deeper in they crept, oblivious of the bears and darker terrors, or none were there. How did they dare?" The narrator is being weirdly melodramatic in their retelling of events. What's actually just going on in the line is that Simon and Stella are walking into a forest. That in of itself is not that weird, but the narrator presents the information in a very strange, intimidating way, almost as if he's trying to tell us a horror story, even though nothing horrific has really happened yet at all. The background instrumentals in the song also back up the sort of foreboding mood of it. There's this distorted piano playing a bunch of very sharp minor chords, and in the climax of the song, there's a whole long section of this very intense instrumental that eventually sort of mellows out. There's no lyrics going on in this climax, so we don't actually know what happens, but we can interpret that it is the murder being described in the title. Let's pause for a minute, because I think it's really important to figure out who exactly the narrator is in this story. Their identity is probably very important to figuring out what is actually going on. Their account of events is pretty suspicious in my opinion. That not only are they just weirdly vague and dramatic about simple actions being taken by Simon and Stella, but they also are almost seemingly like villainizing the entire event, especially villainizing Simon. They go into a lot of detail when they're just describing the events leading up to the murder, but they don't actually give any information about the murder itself. We just assume that the murder happens because of the context of the rest of the song and the context of later in the album. So I'm going to go out on a limb, and this is just, the interpretation that we have put together, and say that the narrator is most likely the culprit of the murder, which is why their narration is so weirdly suspicious and vague. This is their sort of account of events to almost prove themselves innocent and blame the murder on somebody else, which we will be elaborating on with a later song in this album. I would also say that the narrator is probably some kind of ex-lover of Stella, or possibly just someone who is in love with her. They are probably jealous of Simon, which is why they have such resentment towards him in the lyrics, and also why they make the very weird reference to forget-me-nots. Because since I mentioned earlier forget-me-nots are the flower of true love, this would be that the narrator is in love with Stella. They would also give them an actual motive for the murder, which would just make the entire story make a little bit more sense. I think that this interpretation is further backed up by the very last line of the song Murders. It goes, "I was in the forest looking to see the trees, but none were there." It's almost identical to the first line of "he was in the forest looking to see the trees, but none were there," but now the narrator is inserting himself into Simon's position. This could be paralleling the narrator and Simon, since they're both in love with Stella. It could even be a way of communicating that the narrator is, in a way, trying to blame the events of the murder on Simon, which again will be elaborated on later. All right, so let's go on to the next song.
The next song is really quick. The title's in Japanese, and most of the song is in Japanese, except for the line Heaven. The song's actual name is Space Station Level 7, but would not be able to tell that from just reading the names off of a music streaming service. It's really short in actual content. It's mostly just about Stella going to heaven because, she's dead now. This is just really reinforcing that she is dead. Alright, that's it for Space Station Level 7. The next song is The Mind Electric, which starts with half the song being reversed, and it sounds pretty good in reverse, which is kind of impressive. It's hard to make reversed music sound good, and the speech even sounds good. The singing sounds good in reverse too, which is also difficult to do. Whenever it builds up to like a single piano note or chord, where it then reverses down into it reverses the reverse part, which then makes it play forward, and it's set up as like a court case with a deep-voiced judge calling up the resident miner, who is the main character, who Simon then does an insanity plea about probably being charged with the murder of his girlfriend, even though he didn't do it, probably. He pleads insanity, and which is not a good idea, and then things get really, really bad.
Right. So after pleading insanity, presumably to try to get a lighter sentence, the judge character, the deeper voice, says the line, "Condemn him to the infirmary." So we know Simon is now being sent to some kind of mental institution for punishment, for presumably being framed for Stella's death. So while in the infirmary, Simon is sent to the infirmary. While in the infirmary, he begins to get electroshock therapy to try to assumedly cure his insanity, which obviously electroshock therapy is very unethical and does not work. And not only does it just generally not work, but he also isn't insane. As we know, he's innocent, so he actually, ironically, was sane from the beginning and now is actually going insane because of his time in the infirmary. A lot of the lyrics of the song are very strange, abstract, surreal, reflecting Simon's sort of mental state throughout this entire experience that he's having. There's also a lot of religious imagery throughout the song. There's a line that mentions nuns and canting. There's a lot of things about lords and all that kind of thing. So it could be that this is a religious institution as well as sort of a mental asylum. There's another part later in the song where the point of view shifts to what is probably the asylum warden or the prison warden, where he begins to say, "See how the serfs work the ground, and they give it all they've got, and they give it all they've got until they're down." This would be reflecting how the warden is very abusive and sees the prisoners in the institution as serfs, which, you know, are pretty much slaves that were used in Europe. And he sees himself as the lord overseeing these serfs. So this warden is clearly very abusive, and including his abuse of Simon with the electroshock therapy that he goes through. By the end of the song, Simon seems to have gone fully insane with the line, "Doctor, I can't tell if I'm not me." His thoughts are disjointed, and he is just at an all-time rock bottom mentally. The insanity that Simon is now afflicted with is also shown by the fact that the entire first half of the song is in reverse. The only coherent part is the second half. So the reversing of audio sort of shows how his memories have become disjointed and chaotic because of his insanity. So the next song is Labyrinth, which will be pretty brief. It's basically describing how Simon is now feeling trapped in his own mind. The labyrinth is a metaphor for both his mental state, his insanity that he can't escape from, and also the institution that he can't escape physically. He is being chased in the song by what he describes as his ex-girl, so we can assume he's being sort of haunted by Stella. Well, not that she's a ghost and haunting him, but more that he's being haunted by the trauma of her death. The female voice is also in this song, showing how it could be him reminiscing about Stella, or almost his insanity sort of torturing him with the memory of her voice. So the overall story of the song is that he's just talking about how badly he needs to escape this prison, and also how badly he needs to escape his own insanity. So the next song is Time Machine.
The next song is Time Machine, which is about Simon reminiscing about this time before he was trapped and wanting to escape to the past in kind of an escapist sort of way. The song is really distorted. I think that the song itself, like, as a musical piece, it goes really hard. It's a really good song, but it's definitely reflecting his, like, insanity and extremely poor mental state at this time.
Alright, the next song, which is also pretty brief, is Stranded Lullaby. So I've seen a very common interpretation of this song, being that he has escaped at this point, but we personally do not interpret it that way. He describes being lost at sea a lot. I've seen a lot of people saying that he is quite literally a captain on a boat now who is literally has escaped into the ocean and is now lost at sea. But we interpret this as more of a metaphor. Being lost at sea is him just being completely lost in his own mind. There is one line, "I'd like to know why you are alone while I'm lost at sea." The you that he is referring to could be Stella. the Stella being alone in the afterlife without him while he's, lost at sea in the realm of the living. This line is also actually backed by the female voice, which again hammers in the fact that it's probably referencing that he is referring to Stella. He could be thinking about the sea specifically. The song could be referencing the sea specifically because that is where this whole sort of story began. It is called Hawaii Part 2, so we can assume it takes place in Hawaii. So the story likely began with them being on a beach or Simon sailing to Hawaii or something like that. So now it's sort of coming back to this idea of the sea. The story is starting to really come full circle, right, as the album is coming to an end. The final song in Hawaii Part 2 is called Dream Suite in C Major. The title is already pretty interesting because it has some pretty cool puns. Like, instead of Dream Suite as in sweet, the musical suite, S-U-I-T-E, it's sweet as in like a candy, S-W-E-E-T. And in C major, instead of it being the letter C musically, it is C as in an ocean, S-E-A. The fact that it's specifically mentioning the sea is very connected to the lyrics of the song itself, as the song overall is about Simon being lost at sea, kind of a continuation of Stranded Lullaby. So the song starts off with the lyric, "Alone at the edge of the universe humming a tune," which is a direct callback to Introduction to the Snow, really showing how things are coming full circle with this final song. The entire first verse of the song is very, very similar to Introduction to the Snow. One lyrical change, though, is that instead of "You'll live forever tonight," the final line is "We'll go together in flight." The final line being "We'll go together in flight" really shows how, in fact, the line "You'll live forever tonight" was ironic, because as we now know by the end of the story, Simon is not living forever. He is definitely passing away now. The fact that it's specifically mentioning together shows that Simon is joining Stella in the afterlife in flight, which really brings up some imagery of angels. This is another reason why we thought earlier that Simon was not guilty for the murder, because the fact that he is now joining Stella, who we know is in heaven because of Space Station Level 7, it shows that he was a good enough person to go to heaven. So he was likely not guilty for the murder, because if he actually murdered someone, he probably wouldn't be going to heaven. Early in the song, there's a part in French, which is a reference to Space Station Level 7, which also had parts in French, which again shows the fact that this song is meant to be telling the story of Simon going to heaven. Another line, "It feels like flying, but maybe we're dying." Again, I think it's pretty obvious at this point. He's definitely dying. The female voice, Stella, is present in this song. Again, I feel like this is a little bit repetitive, but really showing that he is finally able to join her. There's a lot of melodic references to the rest of the album. There's a part that uses the melody of Black Rainbows. There are parts that use the melody of Space Station Level 7. Overall, the entire song is just really wrapping up the album, both lyrically and musically.
At the end of the song, there's a very clear reference to the light at the end of the tunnel. The blinding star is the literal or metaphorical light at the end of the tunnel as Simon's finally passing on into the next world. And the final verse is Simon wishing goodbye to Hawaii, which is the first time that Hawaii is actually directly mentioned in this album at the very, very end, even though it's called Hawaii Part 2. Then he references one light higher than the sun, invisible to some until its time, which is another very, very, very obvious reference to the afterlife or some kind of light at the end of the tunnel. This whole song and album has a lot of references to sleeping and dreams, which is an interesting thing to mention because it almost makes it seem like this whole album was a dream at the beginning of the song. At the beginning of the song, the speaker says, "We're merely dreaming we were snow," which is a callback to the first song, Introduction to the Snow. And we can assume from that this whole experience was a dream or a reliving of Simon's life. And, he'd been through a lot, and I don't think that he needs to continue to suffer in this world. Maybe this is a bit too
intense and philosophical, but he's definitely experienced a lot. He's been accused of murder and tortured and a lot of other stuff, probably, that's hidden in poetic rhymes and allusions to other media and mythology. Okay, I guess that's the end of this analysis of Dream Suite C Major.
So, that wraps up Hawaii Part 2, the entire album. It's definitely a very complicated story that has a lot of layers, so I'm sure that there are some things that we missed, but this was just our interpretation of the story. Of course, there is no correct interpretation of this album, as it is very abstract in some ways.
I think that the only incorrect interpretation of this album is interpreting it as being about the September 11th terrorist attacks. I don't know why people believe this is the case, but there is a significant community of people believing that this album is about that, even though you'd have to ignore most of the songs to find that conclusion to be sufficiently supported by the evidence in the song.
Overall, this album seems to be tackling a lot of topics about life and death, mortality, love, tragedy, all that kind of stuff. It's super complicated. So we hope that you enjoyed this analysis of Hawaii Part 2. We hope that you could at least learn something new or find a new interpretation of the events being described throughout the story. Alright, thank you for listening. Go stream Hawaii Part 2, and remember to keep it coming back and coming back and coming back.